Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 154 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture are the parts of lust, and I am Dr. Thibault. So we are looking at the subjective parts of temperance, and this is the very last of the articles under the subjective parts of temperance, and it is the parts of lust, which is part of the vices attributed to chastity. So next we will be getting into the potential parts of temperance. Now this question is probably the most controversial one of the most controversial questions in the entire Summa, but certainly the most controversial question in the Secunda Secundae. Many theologically minded people might not have ever read the Summa in any degree, but they know about this question, and they disagree with St. Thomas on it. So I'm going to try to do my best, since St. Thomas is very good with not creating straw men. I will also try not to create a straw man, but as we can see, there's 12 articles. There's a lot of articles in this question. But the final ones are the most controversial, particularly the question 12. So stick around for question 12 if you want the controversial one. And all I'm going to do is present what St. Thomas said. Maybe give a little comment, but these are not because I didn't write it. I'll just say it that way. I didn't write it. It probably would not be what most people would write today. But let's see. So there are 6 species of lust in this section. And they deal with lust in 2 ways. We're dealing with the venereal pleasures. Remember, venereal coming from that kind of term Venus, right? Love, pleasure, sexual pleasures in accordance with right reason. Now, things can be not according to right reason. They can be inordinate in 2 ways. One, it can be the incorrect matter. As an example, somebody else's wife, not your wife, right? That's the wrong matter. Or right circumstances is another example of that. So, perhaps before marriage versus after marriage, right? The same matter, the same person, but a matter of situation. We will get into these 6 species, so I won't go into any more detail with them here, since this will be long enough without that. Okay, so the second article is fornication a mortal sin? Now, St. Thomas doesn't go into any detail describing a definition of any kind of what fornication is. I think so the common understanding of fornication, I think, would suffice. Sexual activity in a broad sense, sexual activity directed outwardly to somebody other than your spouse would be fornication. So fornication is all intercourse with one another other than one's husband or wife would be fornication. Now, simple fornication implies something inordinate, right? Not in the proper ordering, that tends to injure the life of the offspring to be born of this union. This comes up frequently, and I kind of like that part of this question. What is the real damage of fornication and adultery? How about the children involved in this? Right? If you don't care about yourself, you don't care. Sometimes people think of this as a more of a victimless crime, right? It's not really something that's enforced by secular law the way that stealing or murder is enforced by secular law. We say, oh yeah, adultery is bad, but it's not illegal, right? Well, how about the children involved, right? What if you might already have children, they're affected by this, you might get pregnant, you're bringing a child into the world in this situation, that's not ideal. And then somebody might think, well, you can have an abortion. Well, now you're worrying about killing the child, because of your chasing after these cardinal desires. This is the wrong ordering. This is inordinate activity, right? These are the passions, venereal passions that we should not be pursuing because there are consequences to them. And there's kind of a lovely line here in the response to objection 3. It says, it's contrary to the love of our neighbor, which is the child which may be born. To think of, the man having this adulterous act, to think of the child that might be born as the love of his neighbor towards the Christian to be. It's kind of a beautiful image. You kind of think of that in terms of the abortion issue a bit too, which is, what's wrong with abortion? It's contrary to the love of your neighbor, which is that child which has not yet been born. Gives a dignity to it, right? Gives a gospel element of it. And St. Thomas goes into some detail, which is wonderful in the year of St. Joseph. A human, he goes into these other animals. Okay, a dog doesn't need a father, right? A male dog impregnates a female dog. The female dog gives birth. That's enough, right? Maybe birds, that's enough. Well, how about humans? How about humans as animals? What do we need? And he says a human child requires not only a mother's care for I think it should be for his nourishment, right? They're talking about a male child, for his nourishment, but much more the care of his father as a guide and a guardian, and under whom he progresses in goods both internal and external, right? He needs a father, is the idea. So fornication, just using women or women using men, the victims of this is that child is not going to have a stable male role model in his life to be a father. And human children need fathers and mothers. So this is kind of a beautiful line, not one always that you expect from the 13th century, but a good one nevertheless. And it says nature rebels against, at least human nature, rebels against these indeterminate unions, right? It wants determinate unions, right? Stable unions, not these indeterminate unions. I know Black Lives Matter this last summer was talking about kind of getting rid of this idea of the family on their website. Now I know it's been removed, but they had this idea of getting rid of it because, get rid of these ideas of these determinate unions. This is a colonialist perspective. Well, not according to St. Thomas. He thinks that is these determinate relationships for families is part of nature, and to reject the unity of the family is a rebellion against nature, according to St. Thomas, and I think that makes a good deal of sense. Is fornication the most grievous sin? And no, he says no. And you see this a lot within temperance, because temperance is not the most grievous sin. So therefore, the parts of temperance are also not usually the most grievous sin, because they deal with sins of the pleasures, sins of the flesh, and the spiritual sins are much more grievous. We keep using this line from St. Gregory. The gravity of sin is measured against the good to which the sin is opposed. So it's in this situation, what is the real consequence of fornication? That you might create a child, and now the child's not going to have a father within his life. Well, that's bad, right? That's bad. But it's not as bad as murder. right? If you would have murdered the child, then that would be worse than just having the child out of wedlock. You know, we can think of a number of sins that are worse than just having a child not having a father. It's not good, but it's not the most grievous, right? Now, the fourth one's kind of an interesting question. You know, is it a mortal sin to have touches and kisses? It's almost said in a sweet way, touches and kisses. And St. Thomas says, well, you have to look at it in two ways. One is the species itself. So is touching and kissing a mortal sin in and of itself? No, not really. You know, you might kiss your child, you know, you kiss your mother, you know, to hold hands with your child or your parent. You know, there are many ways in which touches and kisses is not in and of itself a mortal sin or a sin at all. But if we look at the cause of the kisses and touches, then maybe. So if the cause of the kisses and touches is one is filled with lust and passion and heat for the other, so they just want to touch them and kiss them, right? Okay, now this is just lust. So if it's just lust, then yes. So, you know, you have to look at the circumstances. Again, you know, remember it's both a matter of matter and circumstances. This is in terms of circumstances. This one is another one that I've heard this talked about since I entered formation many years ago when I was just a youth. You know, our nocturnal emissions, which St. Thomas calls pollution. You know, even if you go back to the Latin, he's talking about pollution, which if you go back to the Latin, it translates more to like mud, soil. So I'm not sure that's a great analogy, but what he's talking about is semen, right? Nocturnal emissions. For anyone who's young, you probably don't have any idea what this is talking about. If you're older, you might have heard it. We live in such a sexually liberated society now that it's not that common of a thing. It's something which probably affects more people in their teenage years, only men, in their teenage years, and it's when there's a lot of sexual desire. And if there's a lot of sexual desire, but there's no sex, the body might emit it on its own, which we might call a wet dream. You might have heard of that. Now, is it a sin? Well, we can look at it in multiple ways. In itself, if we say, well, it's just, you wake up and there was a nocturnal emission. Well, there was no judgment. There was no acting on reason or acting against reason. There was no consciousness. You know, there was literally unconsciousness. So you can't be guilty for something you did when you were unconscious. So in and of itself, no, it's not guilt. There's no sin. Now, it says in terms of its cause, now we look at it in three ways. One is, and perhaps this is a bit of ancient biology, which who knows if it's still applicable, but if there are ideas that by eating meats and heavy foods, sensuous foods, it builds up these fluids in us, which are in excess of food becomes seminal fluid. You know, so it's connected with abstinence of food. You know, right eating of food. But if you just have a buildup of these fluids, these humors, right? The ancients were big into humors. If you have these buildup of humors in your body, just needs to emit it at night. There's no sin. Now he points out that when it's emitted, it might trigger then some type of sexual dream. Like if one were to be peeing when they're sleeping, they might be dreaming about peeing and actually peeing, right? I think you probably heard of those examples before. In a similar way, if you are having a nocturnal emission, maybe it will trigger sexual dreams. Again, you're not responsible for that because it's a reaction from the body. Now, if we look at the inner, how about the inner man, right? Let's say it's not just purely biological. Maybe you are fantasizing about a person in a sexual way during the day, and now when you've gone to sleep, you're dreaming about this, right? You've put it in your mind, and now it's festering, and now it leads to this. Well, if you voluntarily did this, well, now you're somewhat responsible for it because you put it in your head, these ideas, so you're somewhat responsible for it. Now, let's say you watch this video, so now you are talking about it in a theological way, not in a pornographic way, but in a philosophical way. It's still going in your head. So in some ways, you're a little bit responsible for it because, you're putting it in there, but you're not intentionally doing it in a sexual way. So, that one's an in-between one. And then lastly, St. Thomas says the devil. The devil knows that he can create these dreams at night, right? It's very biblical, right? That angels come to St. Joseph at night in the form of a dream. The devil can also come in a dream. And St. Thomas gives the example of the devil doing this to a person, a holy person, at night so that they couldn't receive communion the next day without going to confession. So the devil made me do it could be one of these as well. Now, is seduction a species of lust? Well, there's a very general view of seduction. Seduction, using the framing of St. Ambrose, is just really anything adulterous or fornication-wise. When you're trying to seduce somebody. It can be used in a broader sense. St. Thomas is typically using it in a narrower sense. So in the narrow sense, seduction is aimed at virgins. You have to be a virgin in order to be seduced. If you're a widow or you're not a virgin, you can't be seduced. You can still be guilty of adultery, but seduction is really for virgins, which is, we can kind of look at that as a funny thing, but even in American law, we had this until not that long ago in some states where the age of consent was one thing for virgins and another for non-virgins, because of this idea of kind of seducing the youth, enticing the youth into immorality, right? So if you seduce the youth, that's worse than if the person was already, has had sex before. Now, if you are seducing a virgin, the issue then becomes if once she's not a virgin, now it's going to be harder for her to get married, right? You've broken the seal. And you have also violated the rights of her father, who has guardianship over her and is responsible for getting her married to a good man. So you violated that. There's this really complicated stuff from Deuteronomy, which is in this question, and it's in other questions as well, where, if you rape a virgin, if you have to pay the father, and then he might let you marry her, so then she has to marry the guy that raped her, right? These are awful texts. And St. Thomas uses them because they're in the Bible, but these are awful texts. Luckily, we have, right around this time of St. Thomas, right before, we had the Council of Meaux, M-E-A-U-X, Council of Meaux, which said that if a man rapes a woman, then he does not have the right to marry her by paying the father, which is a nice thing that the church had come up with, is saying that a rapist doesn't get to marry his victim. But even then, it puts the caveat in there, unless the parents agree, which, maybe the girl should have some say in it. But, we can't bring our modernity into medieval texts sometimes. But that's also why I said this is perhaps the most controversial question within the Summa, and at least definitely is the most controversial question within the secunda secundae. Now the other one, rape is a species of lust. Sometimes rape is without seduction, and sometimes seduction is without rape. St. Thomas uses that line twice. So a person can just violently take a girl, or he can entice her away from her family, Romeo and Juliet, I suppose, in a sense, right? Seduce her away from her family. Leave with me and run away, and we'll be happily ever after. That would be seduction, and if he did it, it would be also rape under these rules, because he doesn't have the consent of the father. He says, in a more progressive way, St. Thomas says, rape is rape no matter how the force is applied. That's a good thing. That's nice, that rape is rape. And maybe controversially, St. Thomas also says in response to Article 4, a man cannot rape his wife because they're married, but he does, and that's an issue in American law too, even fairly frequent or fairly recent issue. But if he uses violence or force in any way, he's guilty of the violence or force he inflicted on his wife. So controversial, right? Controversial. Now, adultery is another one. Again, kind of the literal translation of adultery is to access another's marriage bed, to be on the land of another. So adultery is dealing with married people. If St. Thomas looks at it from two perspectives, really the perspective of the man and the perspective of the woman. So in terms of the perspective of the man, the twofold offense, it violates, is contrary to the man's own children. So if a married man sleeps with a woman, he's acting contrary to the good of his own children. They don't say anything about his wife, but at least his children have been offended by that. Also, if she has, the woman has children, he has offended the good of her children. Again, he doesn't mention her husband, but the children are involved. So I think, as much as it's kind of, a bit of an eye roll in some ways, the focus on the children is, I think that is a good perspective, a little bit, because, adults make certain choices, but children are innocent in all this. Children just want to be loved by their parents and grow up in a stable home. If the parents are still being childish, remember that's the issue with temperance is, people being childish, right? If you're not willing to have chastity, to chastise your own sexual passions, how about the kids, right? How about the children involved in this? Now, St. Thomas uses this other perspective from the book of Sirach, which is a bit more woman-based. So she sins against God, although this can also apply to a man, because the Ten Commandments say, thou shalt not commit adultery. So if you do, then you have committed adultery and you violated a sin against God. Second, she sins against her husband. I mentioned that was lacking in St. Thomas's earlier expression. And lastly, she sins against her children, right? So these are the three sins of adultery. Okay, now how about incest? We're going through all of the hot button ones. It's interesting how much we have thrown out of sexual taboo, and almost nothing sexually taboo anymore. Incest still kind of holds on as a sexually taboo thing, right? I think there must be something really innate. And if we look at the explanations for why not to have incest, they're probably some of the weakest arguments, but there's still something we innately hold on to, which makes you think that there must be something deeply rooted in it. I heard one scientist say it's probably to keep us from mating with our own parents, which is probably bad genetically, but there's probably an innate sense of disgust that's built into that, our natural biology, the same type of thing that keeps us away from feces. It's just something that disgusts us, which is probably has a good biological basis for it. So the first one is St. Thomas has a hard time. He uses a lot of words, but it has a hard time really narrowing it down. So you should love your parents and you should love your offspring, and it's very natural to love your parents and your offspring, and you're very close to your parents and your offspring, but you shouldn't love them in that way. And why? It doesn't really say. Today we would say genetics, right? You don't want to mix the genetic pool. He really doesn't have much of an explanation, but he points out even in ancient Roman customs you were not allowed to do this. So in some sense this is an argument of custom, right? This is a customs argument. Now the second one, we live with our offsprings in our families. We're very close with our offsprings and family. If we were to start engaging with them in sexual passionate acts, we would be, since we're seeing them all day long, every day we sleep next to them, it would end up making us in a constant state of sexual passion. Somehow I doubt this would really be true. The more you live with somebody, the less of that magic exists, right? The more you see their faults. You know them for a long time. The passion kind of wears off. The magic wears off. The fourth one St. Thomas throws in is an argument from Aristotle, which is really very similar to the second one. I can't really make a distinction between it. But only other thing I say about the second one, there's all these walls up, morally about, you don't live with somebody before you're married, and all of these rules of, not being too close to each other, not getting too familiar with people until you're married. And then we have brothers and sisters living, right next to each other, eating together, being around each other all the time with almost no boundaries. So the only boundary that you really have is this moral one on incest, right? This is the only one. If you think to a movie, maybe it's a bit old now, like Cruel Intentions, where you have step siblings living together, these can sometimes get a little bit blended, especially if they start living together as teenagers, right? I have boy and girl around the same age living together, and they're step siblings, but they're not really biologically related. These sometimes can create these complicated situations. And lastly, and this one I think is a clever argument, but not necessarily the most convincing, but you'll be very lonely if you marry your own family, because you don't widen your social circles at all. So when you marry somebody, you get a whole new set of parents and brothers and sisters and cousins, and you have a whole new group of people who you're related to. If you marry your own sibling, you have a pretty small circle. Now this is a bit of an issue for the royalty of Europe, but it's not usually much of an issue for anyone else. Okay, is sacrilege? Sacrilege is a species of lust as well. So chastity is directed to the worship of God. So if one uses chastity for the worship of God, it becomes religion, right? So a religious sister, for example, chastity becomes religion. So if you were to have lust against a consecrated person, like a nun, it becomes a sacrilege, which I think is a pretty logical argument. So if you violate a bride of Christ, it's not just lust, it's sacrilege. It's its own species. Now, we're getting to 11 and 12, the two most controversial ones in the secunda secundae. So we're talking about unnatural lust, which is broader than you might think. And it's dealing in two ways. Contrary to right reason, well, that's what we've been dealing with throughout most of this, has been right reason. And now, contrary to the natural order. And that's what we're in now, contrary to the natural order. Maybe incest was a little bit natural order too. So some of this you have to read between the lines to get what St. Thomas is talking about, because he doesn't say it as bluntly as we would say it today. So procuring pollution without copulation, masturbation, right? How else do you have semen without sex? And you are not talking about nocturnal emissions anymore. Well, masturbation. And he calls that unclean and effeminacy. This effeminacy, I guess you're too weak to actually approach another person, so you just turn in on yourself. Unclean, right? This going back to Levitical codes of emissions and things like that. So masturbation is an unnatural lust. Copulation with an undue species, bestiality. Okay, that one's straightforward. Copulation with an undue sex. He calls it the vice of sodomy. Right, same sex, homosexuality. And then by unnatural means. This one, again, you kind of have to read between the lines. He's saying, like animals, copulation without, copulation in an unnatural means like animals. Well, the only thing I can think of for that would be the way that we artificially inseminate cows, for example, right? That would be an unnatural means of copulation. So artificial insemination, ? But I think that's what he's talking about. So, we don't get women pregnant within our society by the same way that we impregnate cows, right? We have the intimacy of sexual relationships with husband and wife, not impregnating people like cows. Now, this could move in a whole form of bioethics today, right, with artificial insemination, which I will not go into any more detail than just pointing at it and keep walking. Now, lastly, this is the most controversial part of the Summa. You could say if a woman gets raped, that the rapist gets to have an opportunity to marry her first. That's pretty offensive too. But that's really coming literally from Scripture. That's St. Thomas is quoting a line from Scripture and trying to make sense of it. This one is actually a construction of Thomas himself, so you can't blame it on Scripture. This is created by Thomas. So, is it unnatural vice the greatest sin among the sin of lust? Not saying the greatest sin, but the greatest among the species of lust, right? And St. Thomas says, therefore, since the unnatural vices man transgresses that which has been determined by nature with regards to the use of venereal actions, it follows that this sin is the gravest of all. And in a more short way, sin contrary to nature, whereby the very order of nature is violated, is an injury done to God. It is the gravest of the sins, is these unnatural vices. And St. Thomas makes very strong arguments within the oppositions. It's like, well, how about, some of these unnatural vices, where's the real victim, right? Where's the real, how does it violate charity? Some of it not so much. How about rape? That's actual violence against a person, right? Rape is clearly worse than unnatural vices, which include perhaps masturbation. Is rape worse than masturbation? And then in the next one, how about sacrilege? Sacrilege is against God, right? Wouldn't sacrilege be against be worse than masturbation, right? And even further, like sacrilege is like defiling a consecrated virgin, a nun. So raping a nun that's got to be worse than unnatural vice, right? St. Thomas points this out, and he answers no. Right? This is why this is so controversial. Masturbation would be a worse sin than raping a nun. Because he says sin contrary to nature, whereby the very order of nature is violated, is an injury done to God. He's looking at it as a sacrilege itself in some ways against the natural order. And I think because it goes to the heart of the continuation of the human species, right? It's the continuation of the human race. It's still a bit of an extreme example. If you're using this as part of your class discussion, preparing for class, you definitely would want to bring this up, but I'm sure your teacher will bring it up too. It's a controversial one for sure. But it is one that some people still make today pretty strongly. Romano Cesario pointed out just recently, within the last 10 years or so, maybe 20 years, in his book on virtues, how masturbating in order to have artificial insemination of a husband and wife would be a mortal sin, because it's involves masturbation, even though the semen will end up in the wife. Right, he could be with his wife when it's going on, but because it's not venereal copulation, vaginal copulation even, it's not. It would be contrary to the natural order, in a violation against God alone. These are the controversial parts of St. Thomas. I will say we should probably not quickly dismiss them. We should struggle with them, knowing St. Thomas was considerably much smarter than me. And it's not that he didn't think about these good exceptions. He did. He put it right out there. On a personal level, I'm not there yet. I don't know if I ever will be, but I'll struggle with it. And curious what your thoughts on it are. These long article ones become very long when it comes to the conclusion. So lust is 6 species. Yes, fornication it can be a mortal sin. Usually is a mortal sin. Fornication is not the greatest sin. Sins of the flesh are usually less than sins of the spirit. Touching and kissing can be a mortal sin. If the cause of the touching and kissing is lust, then it is. If it's just touching and kissing, then no. Nocturnal emissions are usually not a sin unless you put those thoughts in your mind while you are awake. Seduction is a species of lust, usually aimed at virgins. Rape is a species of lust. It's usually can be at anyone, but done with force and seduction, or at least force, sometimes with seduction. Adultery is a species of lust between at least one of the people is married, if not both people are married to somebody else. Incest is a species of lust, to keep our sexual passions outside of our immediate families is a good idea. Sacrilege is a species of lust. If somebody is consecrated to God, they should be left to be the spouse of God, not for you. Sin against nature is a species of lust, of which there are many species of lust, from masturbation to bestiality are these natural, unnatural species of lust. And sins against nature, the greatest of these, the greatest of the sins of lust are sins against nature, which is a sin against the natural order which God has created. Therefore, it's a sin against God. So we are done now with the subjective parts of temperance, and we're moving on to the potential parts of temperance.